The recent attacks have reduced the tonnage significantly, sir.
We must reroute the northern convoys immediately.
January 1943. Berlin is wrapped in winter silence, broken only by the low hum of electric lamps inside the Naval High Command. Cigarette smoke hangs in the air, unmoving. Maps of the Atlantic cover the walls, lines of chalk tracing convoy routes from North America to Britain. Beneath them, blackboards list numbers, tonnage sunk, U-boats lost, ships reported destroyed. A staff officer steps forward and updates the figures. The chalk pauses, then continues. The numbers do not fall. They rise. For 3 years, German commanders have measured success by absence, by empty sea lanes, by shortages in British ports, by the slow strangulation of an island empire. But now the Atlantic refuses to empty. Convoys still arrive. Not fewer, but more. The reports from U-boat captains speak of endless columns of hulls, gray and identical, appearing again weeks after being sunk. Admiral Karl Donitz studies the board without speaking. He understands what the numbers are suggesting, even if no one says aloud. Somewhere beyond the reach of torpedoes, beyond the range of reconnaissance aircraft, something larger than fleets is at work. And to understand how the ocean stopped emptying, the story must widen, beyond the Atlantic itself, to the forces shaping the war before these numbers ever appeared. In September 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, the Kriegsmarine entered the war with a clear understanding of its limits. It was not built to fight the Royal Navy ship for ship. Britain possessed more battleships, more cruisers, more destroyers, and a global network of bases stretching from Halifax to Gibraltar. Germany's surface fleet, still recovering from the restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles, could not challenge that power directly. Instead, German naval doctrine turned to absence rather than presence. The Atlantic would be won not by dominating it, but by emptying it. The strategy had roots in the First World War. U-boats, submarines operating alone or in loose coordination, would sever Britain's maritime lifelines. Britain imported more than half of its food and raw materials by sea. Coal, iron, ore, oil, grain, and military equipment crossed the Atlantic daily. If those routes could be cut, Britain would be forced to negotiate or collapse from within. At the center of this vision stood Karl Donitz. A veteran submariner of the previous war, Donitz believed that U-boats, used aggressively and in numbers, could succeed where Germany had failed in 1917. His concept of Rudel tactic, wolf-pack tactics, relied on submarines operating as scouts and attackers, converging on convoys at night, striking in coordinated assaults. Early conditions favored him. In 1939 and 1940, Britain lacked sufficient escort vessels. Many destroyers were committed elsewhere. Radar and sonar technology was still immature. Aircraft coverage over the Atlantic was incomplete, leaving vast air gaps where convoys sailed blind and unprotected. As France fell in June 1940, the strategic situation tilted further. German U-boats gained access to Atlantic ports along the French coast, Lorient, Brest, Saint-Nazaire. From these bases, submarines no longer had to run the dangerous gauntlet of the North Sea. They could reach the Atlantic quickly and remain on patrol longer. Sinkings increased. By late 1940 and into 1941, Britain's shipping losses became severe. Merchant vessels went down faster than they could be replaced. Convoys arrived incomplete. Insurance rates climbed. Rationing tightened. The war at sea began to feel like a slow suffocation. Yet even in these early years, limits were visible. Germany never possessed the number of U-boats Donitz believed necessary. He had argued that 300 operational submarines were required to break Britain's lifeline. In reality, he had far fewer. Each loss mattered. Each damaged boat took months to repair. Then there was the problem of production. German industry, oriented toward land warfare, prioritized tanks, artillery, and aircraft for continental campaigns. Submarine construction expanded, but not at the pace required for a long war of attrition at sea. Still, through 1941, the balance appeared fragile. Britain endured. Convoy systems improved incrementally. Canadian shipyards expanded. American shipyards, though not yet at war, began building escort vessels and merchant ships under programs like Lend-Lease. Supplies flowed eastward even before the United States formally entered the conflict. December 1941 changed the scale of the war overnight. Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor brought the United States fully into the conflict. What had been a European naval struggle now became a global one. For German commanders, this new enemy was not feared for its fleets, at least not yet, but for its capacity. The United States possessed coastlines untouched by bombing, rivers that ran directly into industrial centers, and an economy that dwarfed anything in Europe. At first, this potential remained theoretical. But as the war entered 1942, the Atlantic began to reveal signs that theory was becoming reality. And as U-boats moved toward the American coast, German commanders prepared for what they believed would be their greatest opportunity, unaware that the foundations of their strategy were already being undermined far from the sea. When American industry shifted toward war, it did so without subtlety. The question was never whether the United States could build ships. It was how fast, how many, and with how little interruption. In early 1941, even before Pearl Harbor, planners in Washington understood the Atlantic as the decisive artery of the conflict. Britain could fight only if supplies arrived. The Soviet Union, newly invaded by Germany in June, would survive only if material crossed oceans and icebound ports. The problem was not strategy. It was volume. Traditional shipbuilding could not meet that demand. Pre-war merchant vessels were complex, individually crafted, and slow to produce. A single ship could take many months from keel to launch. Skilled labor was required at every step. That tempo belonged to peacetime. The answer emerged from an unlikely combination of urgency and simplification. The Liberty ship was not designed to be elegant or long-lived. It was designed to exist. Based loosely on a British tramp steamer design, it was adapted for mass production using American industrial methods. Welding replaced riveting. Hull sections were prefabricated inland, then transported to coastal yards. Components were standardized. Training focused on speed rather than craftsmanship. Men and women with no prior shipbuilding experience were taught single tasks and repeated them thousands of times. Henry J. Kaiser became the most visible symbol of this transformation. His shipyards, stretching from California to the Pacific Northwest, operated on principles borrowed from automobile assembly lines. Work continued around the clock. Floodlights turned night into day. Launches became routine events rather than celebrations. The results shocked even American planners. The first Liberty ships took months to complete. By 1942, that time had dropped dramatically. Some hulls were assembled in weeks. One ship, the SS Robert E. Peary, was famously constructed in just over 4 days, not as a standard, but as a demonstration of possibility. Quantity became the strategy. Losses at sea were no longer final. A sunk ship represented not an irreplaceable asset, but a temporary setback. For every vessel destroyed, another was already sliding down the ways. German intelligence noticed the change, but struggled to quantify it. Reports from U-boat commanders in early 1942 still spoke of success. Along the American East Coast, where coastal blackouts were slow to be enforced, submarines enjoyed what became known as the second happy time. Ships burned visibly from shore. Sinkings climbed. Yet beneath those reports lay a troubling inconsistency. Tonnage figures failed to tell the full story. While U-boats sank more ships than ever, The total number of Allied merchant vessels in service did not fall accordingly. Convoys grew longer. Escort coverage thickened. Sinkings felt tactically impressive but strategically hollow. By late 1942, the math began to betray the illusion. American yards were launching ships faster than U-boats could sink them. The balance had shifted from hunting to counting. Admiral Donitz received these figures with growing unease. His war depended on cumulative absence, on reducing Allied shipping below survival levels. But now the Atlantic refused to empty. The sea lanes remained full, not because submarines failed, but because industry refused to slow. This realization did not arrive in a single moment. It unfolded gradually, through reports, graphs, and unanswered questions. German commanders began to sense that they were no longer fighting fleets or tactics. They were fighting time. And as the war at sea entered its most critical phase, the struggle revealed itself from multiple angles: human, technical, and psychological, each exposing a different weakness in Germany's plan. From the bridge of a U-boat, the Atlantic still looked conquerable. The ocean was vast, the convoys predictable, the nights long. For the men below the surface, success was measured in silhouettes: black hulls against a lighter horizon, exhaust plumes catching moonlight, the moment when a torpedo track disappeared beneath a target's bow. U-boat crews did not see statistics. They saw individual victories. A freighter struck, a column of flame. The shudder of detonation transmitted through water and steel. In patrol logs, these moments accumulated into tallies that suggested dominance. Many commanders returned to port believing they were winning. But the human angle cut both ways. For every sinking, crews also witnessed something new. Days or weeks after destroying a ship, they encountered convoys of similar size, similar shape, sometimes even larger. The ships looked the same: gray hulls, boxy profiles, crude but functional. Liberty ships were indistinguishable at sea, and that sameness unsettled men accustomed to unique prizes. Above them, German leadership wrestled with a widening gap between tactical reports and strategic reality. Admiral Donitz continued to refine tactics, pressing for aggressive patrols and closer coordination. Yet he could not escape the arithmetic. Sinkings had to exceed construction. No maneuver could change that rule. This was where industrial reality intruded into naval warfare. Liberty ships were not impressive individually. They were slow, vulnerable, and lightly armed. Their strength lay entirely in numbers. Welding allowed faster assembly, but also introduced early structural issues, some holes cracked in cold waters. These problems were studied, corrected, and production continued without pause. 4 German planners trained in decisive engagements. This adaptability was alien. Industrial warfare did not pause for analysis. It absorbed losses and moved on. Technology widened the gap further. Allied escorts improved steadily. Radar began detecting surfaced submarines at night. High-frequency direction finding, HF/DF, known to sailors as Huff Duff, pinpointed U-boat radio transmissions. Aircraft extended their reach deeper into the Atlantic, shrinking the air gap where submarines once operated freely. Each innovation reduced the advantage of surprise. Each convoy became harder to penetrate. U-boat commanders now spent more time evading than attacking. Yet the most profound change remained invisible. Liberty ships turned the Atlantic into a conveyor belt. Cargo did not arrive heroically. It arrived inevitably. Food, fuel, vehicles, ammunition, everything required for war crossed the ocean in steady, unstoppable flows. For Allied convoy commanders, the mindset shifted accordingly. Their goal was not to save every ship. It was to keep the flow moving. Losses were accepted, calculated, and replaced. Where earlier sinkings had caused panic, they now triggered paperwork. This acceptance horrified German observers. In intercepted communications, and post-war recollections, German officers expressed disbelief at Allied tolerance for loss. They mistook it for callousness, failing to see it as confidence. The moral dimension of the struggle became clear. Germany sought decisive effects from individual actions. The Allies pursued endurance. One side hunted, the other absorbed. By 1943, the Atlantic War had become a contest between courage and capacity. U-boat crews continued to sail into danger, often with outdated equipment and dwindling odds. Many never returned. Their sacrifice, real and measurable, could not overcome a system designed to replace ships faster than men could destroy them. And as this imbalance deepened, it became clear that the struggle could not be understood from a single perspective. To grasp why German commanders were truly stunned, the lens had to widen further, toward the enemy they faced, the tools that protected the convoys, and the creeping realization that some wars are lost without a final battle. From the Allied side of the Atlantic, the war appeared less dramatic, but no less relentless. Convoy commanders did not speak of victory in terms of sinkings avoided. They spoke of schedules met, ports cleared, cargo delivered. A successful crossing was often marked only by routine signals and a quiet return to station. The Liberty ship embodied this philosophy. Crews knew their vessels were slow and exposed. They also knew another ship was already being built. This knowledge did not remove fear, but it framed it. Survival was individual. The mission was collective. Technological adaptation accelerated this shift. Escort carriers, small and utilitarian, filled the gaps once left open to U-boats. Their aircraft patrolled constantly, forcing submarines underwater and draining batteries. Sonar improved. Depth charges became more precise. Later, ahead-thrown weapons like the Hedgehog allowed escorts to attack without losing contact. Each improvement compounded the last. A surface submarine spotted by radar was forced to dive. Once submerged, it became vulnerable to sonar. Trapped underwater, it moved slowly, blind and constrained. What had once been a predator now survived by avoidance. German commanders recognized these trends, but recognition did not equal remedy. New submarine designs, including the advanced type XXI, promised solutions, but development lagged behind necessity. Production delays, Allied bombing, and material shortages ensured that these boats arrived too late to alter the outcome. Meanwhile, Liberty ships continued to slide into the water. By war's end, more than 2,700 had been built. They carried tanks to North Africa, trucks to the Soviet Union, and rations to Britain. They carried the war itself. The psychological impact on German leadership grew sharper with each report. Naval warfare had traditionally rewarded initiative, daring, and tactical brilliance. Here, none of those qualities could reverse the trend. The enemy did not need to outfight the U-boats. It needed only to outlast them. This realization struck at the moral core of command. Officers trained to seek decisive engagement found themselves watching tonnage curves instead of battle plans. Victory became a statistical threshold rather than a heroic moment. For Donitz, this was particularly bitter. His faith in submarines was not misplaced in theory. They had inflicted real damage. But the enemy he faced was not static. It learned faster, built faster, and replaced faster. By mid-1943, the outcome was no longer uncertain. Losses mounted. Crews sailed with diminishing expectations. The Atlantic, once a hunting ground, became a graveyard. Yet Liberty ships kept coming. Their arrival was quiet, almost banal. No single launch marked a turning point. No single convoy declared victory. The triumph lay in continuity, the refusal to stop. And in that continuity, the war reached its decisive moment. Not in a single explosion, but in the steady collapse of an assumption that the sea could be emptied. The moment when that assumption finally broke would come not with celebration, but with acceptance, with orders rewritten, with strategies abandoned. That moment, slow and undeniable, formed the true climax of the Battle of the Atlantic. The year 1943 did not begin with a single disaster for the German Navy. There was no sudden annihilation, no decisive engagement announced over the radio. Instead, the shift revealed itself through accumulation, through weeks when U-boats failed to return, through patrols that ended without contact, through convoys that crossed oceans intact. In January, German submarines were still at sea in strength. Orders remained aggressive. Wolf packs were deployed across known convoy routes. Yet the results no longer matched the effort. Where earlier attacks had produced chaos, now they produced resistance, organized, layered, and persistent. Allied convoys moved with confidence that bordered on inevitability. Escort screens thickened. Destroyers, corvettes, and frigates operated as integrated units, guided by centralized command and real-time intelligence. Aircraft circled overhead, denying U-boats the surface time they required to recharge batteries and reposition. The Atlantic narrowed. Safe zones disappeared. Losses began to tell their own story. In March 1943, U-boats achieved one of their last significant successes, sinking dozens of merchant ships. But the cost was unprecedented. Submarines failed to return at an alarming rate. The exchange ratio, the true measure of the campaign, turned decisively against Germany. In the command centers of Berlin and Paris, tonnage boards were updated with grim regularity. Sinkings were still recorded, but next to them appeared a growing list of losses. Boats gone, crews presumed lost. There were no replacements waiting in equal number. Training pipelines strained. Morale quietly eroded. Donuts pressed for innovation. New tactics were ordered. Submarines were instructed to avoid heavily defended convoys. Yet avoidance meant irrelevance. A U-boat that did not attack did not contribute to victory. Meanwhile, Allied shipyards continued their rhythm. Liberty ships launched weekly, then daily. The flow of hulls into the Atlantic did not pause for strategic reassessment. It obeyed production schedules, not battlefield outcomes. By May 1943, the turning point could no longer be denied. In that single month, Germany lost more than 40 U-boats. The Atlantic, once permissive, became lethal. Crews reported near-constant detection. Survivors spoke of unseen enemies, of sudden explosions, of escorts that seemed to anticipate their every move. Donuts faced an impossible decision: continue the offensive and lose the core of the submarine force, or withdraw and concede the Atlantic. On May 24, 1943, he chose preservation over persistence. U-boats were ordered out of the North Atlantic's main convoy routes. It was not a surrender. It was an admission. The withdrawal marked the end of the U-boat campaign as a strategic threat. Submarines would continue to operate, but the decisive phase was over. The flow of Allied shipping would no longer be meaningfully disrupted. In German headquarters, there was no ceremony marking this moment. Only quiet acknowledgement. The war had shifted beyond their control. And behind every statistic, every lost boat, every altered order, stood a simple, crushing truth. Even had every U-boat survived, even had every torpedo struck true, the ships would still have kept coming. The Atlantic had revealed its answer, not through battle, but through endurance. Yet the full weight of this realization, what it meant for Germany's war, and why it could not be reversed, would only become clear as the consequences unfolded in detail. After the withdrawal order, the Atlantic grew quieter, not safer, but more certain. Convoys still faced danger, but the sense of imminent collapse that once haunted Allied planners was gone. The shipping lanes remained crowded. Ports stayed supplied. The war machine continued to turn. Inside German Naval Command, the tone changed. Meetings no longer revolved around how to break Britain's lifeline. but how to conserve what remained of the submarine arm. New technologies were discussed with urgency bordering on desperation. Acoustic torpedoes, radar warning receivers, streamlined hulls. Each offered promise, none offered immediacy. The Type XXI submarine became the embodiment of hope deferred, designed to remain submerged for extended periods and outrun escorts underwater. It represented a fundamental shift in submarine warfare. On paper, it could have challenged Allied dominance. In reality, it arrived too late, in too few numbers, and with too many technical issues to alter the strategic balance. Meanwhile, the arithmetic continued. By mid-1943, Allied ship production exceeded losses by a wide margin. Liberty ships were joined by Victory ships, faster, more refined successors. The Atlantic pipeline thickened further. German intelligence reports grew increasingly blunt. Analysts acknowledged that the destruction of Allied shipping could no longer achieve decisive results. Even optimistic projections failed to reverse the trend. The numbers refused to bend. For commanders raised on operational maneuver, this was a defeat without spectacle. There was no battlefield to reclaim, no counterattack to plan. The enemy's strength lay beyond reach, embedded in factories, rail lines, and labor forces spread across a continent. The emotional weight of this realization settled unevenly. Some officers clung to technological salvation. Others accepted the outcome with resignation. For the crews still sent to sea, the change was more immediate. Patrols became exercises in survival. Success was defined by return, not impact. Liberty ships continued to cross the Atlantic in anonymous columns. Their crews rotated, their cargo unloaded, their hulls repaired or replaced. The system absorbed strain without visible stress. By late 1943, the Atlantic was no longer contested in any meaningful sense. It was controlled. Control did not mean invulnerability. It meant predictability. And predictability in war is power. This control reshaped the wider conflict. Troops crossed oceans in numbers previously unimaginable. Equipment arrived intact and on schedule. Plans that once seemed risky became routine. German commanders understood the implication with clarity. Without the ability to disrupt shipping, Germany could not prevent an Allied return to the European continent. The war would come westward, carried not by daring raids, but by freight. The decisive moment of the Battle of the Atlantic did not end with an explosion or surrender. It ended with the quiet acceptance that the sea had been lost, not to fleets, but to production. And as Liberty ships continued to arrive, month after month, their presence reshaped everything that followed. What remained now were consequences, measured not only in ships and submarines, but in the direction of the entire war. With the Atlantic secured, the consequences unfolded rapidly, though rarely dramatically. There were no victory parades for merchant shipping, no medals for tonnage delivered. Yet every successful crossing translated directly into strategic freedom. For the Allies, logistics ceased to be a limiting factor. Britain's ports filled steadily. Stockpiles grew rather than shrank. Fuel reserves stabilized. Food shortages eased. The fear that had once governed every convoy decision faded into planning assumptions. This abundance altered Allied strategy at every level. Operations no longer had to be shaped around scarcity. Instead, they were shaped around timing. North Africa had already demonstrated what sustained supply could achieve. Now the scale expanded. In 1943 and 1944, millions of tons of material crossed the Atlantic. Tanks, trucks, artillery, aircraft components, all arrived in predictable waves. Liberty ships delivered not just equipment, but certainty. Commanders could plan months ahead, confident that resources would arrive when needed. For Germany, the loss of the Atlantic translated into strategic paralysis. The submarine arm, once envisioned as a decisive force, became a defensive concern. Resources diverted to U-boat construction now produced diminishing returns. Every boat launched faced an environment hostile beyond recovery. German surface forces were largely irrelevant by this stage. Air power could harass shipping, but not disrupt it at scale. The sea lanes remained open. The psychological impact within German command was profound. Officers accustomed to initiative found themselves reacting rather than shaping events. The war's momentum had shifted irreversibly. This shift became visible in Allied planning for Western Europe. Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy, depended entirely on uncontested shipping. Troops, vehicles, fuel, ammunition, and food would all have to cross the channel in enormous quantities, then be sustained continuously. Such an operation would have been unthinkable in 1941 or even early 1942. By late 1943, it was assumed. The Atlantic no longer posed a question. Liberty ships played a central role even after the landings. They supplied the artificial harbors at Normandy. They fed the advancing armies. They replaced losses without interruption. When ports were damaged or destroyed, shipping adapted. The flow continued. German commanders watched this with grim clarity. Reports from the front spoke of Allied units lavishly supplied, mobile, and resilient. Attempts to isolate or starve them failed. The logistical advantage shaped every engagement. The Battle of the Atlantic, once envisioned as a duel of stealth and courage, revealed its true nature in these months. It was a prerequisite battle, one whose outcome determined all others. And as the war pressed toward Germany's borders, the ships kept coming. Even as cities burned under bombing raids and fronts collapsed, American yards continued launching hulls into the water. The Atlantic had become a one-way corridor. Yet the full weight of this transformation, what it meant beyond immediate military success, would only emerge when the war ended and the numbers were finally examined. When the war ended, the accounting began. Analysts on both sides turned from operational reports to ledgers. They counted ships built, ships sunk, crews lost, cargo delivered. In these figures, the outcome of the Atlantic War appeared with stark clarity. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States alone produced thousands of merchant vessels. Liberty ships formed the backbone of this effort, joined later by Victory ships. At the peak of production, American yards launched more tonnage in a single month than Germany could sink in a year. The imbalance was not marginal. It was overwhelming. German submarine losses told the other side of the story. Of approximately 40,000 U-boat crewmen who served during the war, more than 30,000 did not survive. Entire flotillas vanished. The human cost of persistence against impossible odds was immense. Post-war German naval assessments were unflinching. The failure was not attributed to courage or competence. It was attributed to miscalculation. The assumption that industrial output could be disrupted faster than it could be expanded proved false. The enemy had not merely replaced losses. It had accelerated because of them. Allied reports reached similar conclusions from the opposite direction. Victory at sea was credited not to a single weapon or tactic, but to systems working in concert: production, escort doctrine, intelligence, and air coverage. Liberty ships were cited repeatedly as enablers rather than heroes. Many of these vessels were scrapped after the war. Others continued to sail for decades, carrying civilian cargo across a world reshaped by the conflict they had supported. Their legacy was practical, not symbolic. For German commanders, the lesson endured. Naval warfare had entered an industrial age where traditional measures of excellence were insufficient. Control of the sea depended on factories as much as fleets. The Atlantic campaign faded into history without a clear end date. There was no armistice at sea. The battle simply stopped being contested. What remained was understanding. The war had been decided long before the final shots, in shipyards far from the front lines, by workers whose names never appeared in dispatches. And in that realization lay a deeper truth, one that extended beyond World War II and into the nature of modern conflict itself. That truth belongs not to aftermath, but to reflection. The Battle of the Atlantic did not end with a flag lowered or a fleet destroyed. It ended with a realization, quiet, undeniable, and irreversible. German commanders did not lose the sea because they lacked courage, skill, or sacrifice. They lost it because the nature of war had changed beneath their feet. Liberty's ships were not remarkable machines. They were slow. They were vulnerable. Many never fired a shot in anger. Yet they represented something more powerful than any weapon deployed against them. They represented continuity, the ability to absorb loss without collapse, the refusal to stop. In earlier wars, the destruction of ships carried finality. Each loss weakened a nation measurably. In this war, loss became temporary. Industry erased it. The ocean, once a battleground of daring and deception, became a channel governed by schedules and output. For Germany, this was a lesson learned too late. Submarines could sink ships, but they could not sink a continent's capacity to build them. Strategy failed not because it was flawed in conception, but because it faced an enemy operating on a scale beyond interception. The Liberty ship story is not one of heroics in the traditional sense. It is a story of repetition, of welders and riveters working under floodlights, of hulls sliding into water day after day, of victory achieved without spectacle. Modern warfare would carry this lesson forward. Control of supply lines would prove as decisive as control of battlefields. Production would rival tactics. Endurance would outweigh brilliance. When German commanders looked at their maps in 1943 and saw convoys that never ended, they were witnessing more than a logistical problem. They were witnessing the future of war. And in that future, the outcome was no longer decided by who fought harder, but by who could keep going longer. That is why the Liberty ships never needed to stop arriving. Because once they started, the war was already decided.